This is air temperature. And as you can physically see, this thermometer is reading the temperature of the air about 2 meters up from the ground. As it turns out, the ground itself can actually be a whole lot lower than that temperature you're seeing right there. It makes sense. The reason we warm up during the day is the sun beats down on the ground. The ground sort of absorbs that radiation and heats the air in contact with it. Well, overnight, all that radiation the ground absorbed throughout the day is being lost to the air. And on a clear night like what we had on our Sunday night, Monday morning, the ground loses a whole lot of radiation and can be much colder than that air temperature I showed you. Speaking of that, this IR thermometer reading the ground temperature at a very cold 29 degrees. In fact, 13 feet plus of water in both spots, too high for our monitors to even really be able to show you. So for that, let's go ahead and zoom it out. Here's what 13 feet of water looks like. To be able to do it, I have to climb this 8-foot ladder, bring out my measuring tape, add an extra 55 inches on top of our tall monitor here in the studio, and there you go. That's what 13 plus feet of water looks like. You see that? It's no surprise the damage was what it was in Fort Myers Beach in Sanibel. Note this sort of bowing area, how it's jutting out near where Tucker's Corner is marked, and then a little bit of an area of lesser rainfall there too. That's signs that not only are winds very strong here right along 31 at the moment, I suspect we have 40 to 50 mile per hour winds in this location right now, but there is also some inflow going on here into the storm, so still picking up on some rotation within that cell at this moment. In fact, let me go ahead and switch over to our velocity mode. We can see the area I'm talking about right there. This is off to the north of the Babcock Ranch area on 31. There's Bermont Corner, that intersection, that one stoplight on 31. This is just to the south and east of this. This cell actually is showing quite a bit of tightening in that rotation just in the last few moments. Now east of 31, this is going to be headed into the northwestern side of Hendry County. This eventually will make its way towards the Venus area, likely stays just to the north of Harrisburg, of Palmdale, of Moorhaven. But again, this storm is racing. Let me put a track on this for you. This is moving off to the east. We will call it at 45 miles per hour. And this will be nearing the Venus area, just north of Harrisburg and Palmdale, as we get to about 7:15 and 7:30. So Bermont right now seeing the worst of the wind and the rain. In fact, let me go ahead and sample some of these winds for you, because even outside of any potential for a tornado, these winds are awfully strong. These storms are moving at 45 to 50 miles per hour, and we are clocking wind gusts, winds at 35, 40 miles per hour. We've seen numerous reports of wind gusts over 40 miles per hour already here this morning. And again, in particular, right now, the primary area of concern, moving away from 31 right there, little area of rotation. If there is some good news, as this rotation appears to be tightening up, this is going over a very sparsely populated area. This is headed over the Babcock Ranch Preserve. Babcock Ranch itself further to the south of this, just to clarify. Jess, is that a new warning that just came in?
Yep, we do now have a tornado warning. That's for Charlotte until 6:45.
Yeah, and I suspect when that comes up, that's going to be right for that area of the storm.
8 miles east of Babcock Ranch.
How many miles east of Babcock Ranch?
8 miles east of Babcock Ranch, or 16 miles northwest of LaBelle, moving east at 55 miles per hour.
There you go. There's that tornado warning. We're going to get a fresh update, a full update from the Hurricane Center coming up at 11 o'clock. But if this is the first time you're checking in since yesterday evening, here's sort of the latest on what has occurred overnight and early this morning with Idalia. The storm's a little bit stronger. The sustained winds up to 65 miles per hour, now moving to the due north. Moving, period. You know, overnight last night through parts of the day yesterday, it was stationary. Now starting to pick up momentum as it moves to the north, following that forecast track to the north. Big change in the forecast at 5 o'clock. It's now forecast to be a major hurricane as it approaches Florida's Big Bend going into early Wednesday morning. For us in southwest Florida, the expected impacts haven't necessarily changed all that much. We're under a tropical storm watch. Many of us likely to see tropical storm conditions as this passes by. A storm surge watch for much of the coastline of southwest Florida here too. So where's Idalia right now? Sitting about 480 miles off to the south and west of Cape Coral, and again, tracking northward into the Gulf of Mexico. If there's two things I want you to sort of remember and take away from my weathercast here today as we watch the approach of Idalia, it's that impacts extend outside of the cone, as we'll talk about in a moment, and then two, every storm, every tropical storm, every hurricane is different, and every storm that will impact us will bring different impacts. I know it's human nature to take a system and to compare it to something that you can wrap your head around that's similar, which would, in our case, be what happened a year ago with Ian. But here's Idalia right now. We're sitting at 20.6 north latitude, moving to the due north at 8 miles per hour. I want you to compare that, where it is right now at that latitude, to where Ian and Charlie were at a similar latitude. This is sitting already about 130 miles west of where Ian was. As you'll recall, it cut across western Cuba and way to the west, nearly 300 miles to the west of where Charlie was at this point in the game. And as you look forward, here's the NHC track forecast. Again, remember, this is just a forecast, not exactly what is going to occur here. But look at the difference between that track forecast and what Ian and Charlie did. To get to that, you would have to see a much more pronounced easterly turn. And at this point, I'm just not seeing anything in the atmosphere, anything in the steering currents to make the storm turn to the east. A tropical storm, a hurricane, is going to continue on the path it's on until it's acted on by an outside force. Right now, it's starting to move north as it's feeling the pull of this front and the upper level dip in the jet stream that's supporting it that's in the northeast. By the time we get to tomorrow morning, that front is hanging over Louisiana, the northern Gulf Coast. It's a fairly weak front, too. As you know, we don't really get those strong cold fronts into Florida this early in the season. Think back to last year as we were tracking Ian. One of the big forecasting challenges was figuring out where that strong early season cold front was going to be and how it would interact. That front was sitting right over central Florida as Ian approached. We're talking a front hundreds of miles off to the north and west that, if anything, is just going to help to keep it on that northerly track until it gets to about Tampa's latitude, and then it begins to make that turn to the north and east. And just about every model you look at shows that exact scenario. There you go, the model plots, each line a different model forecast, all lined up. The Big Bend on northward, Tampa on northward. In fact, in this latest suite of models, they're sort of tracking a little further north here. These are three of the more reliable forecast models I like to look at when it comes to tropical forecasting. The European in green, the GFS in white, our in-house storm tracker model in yellow. I'm showing you isobars or lines of equal pressure. Where you see that bullseye, that would be where the center of Idalia would be once we get to Wednesday morning. All three sitting well to the west of southwest Florida by 1 a.m. on Wednesday. European a little further to the east, but of note, also showing a slightly weaker storm. That's something else that has been represented in the models. The ones that tend to keep it a little bit weaker do bring it a little closer to Tampa, perhaps even closer to southwest Florida. Those that show a stronger, more impactful storm, a major hurricane, tend to keep it on a more due northerly course. Now, intensity, that is the big question mark forecast-wise, where models are very closely in line as far as the path forecast right now. We have high confidence in that path forecast right now. Still question marks as far as the intensity. The storm is over some very, very warm waters and deep warm water. This is ocean heat content, so not just looking at the sea surface temperatures, which, as we've been telling you, are well above average in the Gulf, in the Caribbean, but also how deep that warm water goes. That's the fuel for a tropical system. Whole lot of ocean heat content for this to work with. This is going to move over what's called the Gulf of Mexico's loop current, warm water that moves out of the Caribbean into the Gulf, and with that will tend to lead to a strengthening storm. On the other side of things, there is going to be some wind shear at play here too. So a very difficult intensity forecast. The Hurricane Center admitting in their updates they're leaning on the higher side of the guidance as far as the intensity forecast here. Not messing around with that. Calling for a Category 3 storm sitting off to the west of Tampa by 2 a.m. Wednesday. So timing-wise, there's 2 o'clock Tuesday afternoon. This will make its closest pass to southwest Florida sometime between 6 p.m. tomorrow evening and about midnight. Again, what that cone shows you, average forecast error over the last 5 years. They determine the width of that cone before the hurricane season begins. History tells you the center could be anywhere from here to here by the time we get to 2 a.m. on Wednesday. The closer this gets to us, generally speaking, the more severe the impacts will be. And yes, despite the fact that we are not in that cone, the point number 2 I want you to take from my weathercast today, impacts can and do extend outside the cone, and that is going to be the case with Idalia. We are going to see impacts from this storm regardless of exactly where that center goes, regardless of if it continues on its expected course, stays off to our west. Here's our storm tracker model showing you a strengthening Idalia in the Gulf of Mexico due west of the Keys by the time we get to 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, continuing on that north-northeasterly course, staying well off to our west. But note, we're in those rain bands. That's still going to bring some heavy rain, and this will be a fairly wide wind field at this point in time. Will likely be in those tropical storm force winds as well. Heavy rain, the main concern at this point, the most widespread impact at this point from Idalia. Along with that, tropical storm force winds, 40, 50, 60-mile-per-hour winds, not out of the question. We'll watch for coastal flooding, especially at high tide, something we're going to dive into in depth coming up in the next half hour. And even the threat for isolated tornadoes. Anytime you get those rain bands on the eastern side of the storm whipping in, you have to watch for brief spin-up tornadoes, something we'll be watching closely tomorrow. So again, we'll be tracking this storm around the clock for you here at ABC 7. Much more on Idalia coming up through the next half hour. After Ian, I heard from so many of you asking how Cabbage Key fared. I'm going to be honest, I didn't have high hopes. After all, Cabbage Key is a tiny island situated right in the middle of the Pine Island Sound. And that island, only about a mile away from where I'm standing, is Cayo Costa, which, as you'll recall, is where Ian made landfall with 150-mile-per-hour sustained winds. And yet, while Ian took so many iconic spots and landmarks from us in Southwest Florida, Cabbage Key was thankfully not one of them. In fact, managing partner Rob Wells says only 2 weeks after Ian hit, the restaurant was back open and ready to serve a hurricane-weary Southwest Florida.
Our goal was, hey, we've got something that we can get back open again, and let's get after it. And within 2 weeks, we were taking some form of payment, and we were open and had enough docks and things cobbled back together to welcome customers back in.
But how is that even possible? One factor, the eye of the storm. Thanks to Ian's path, Cabbage Key ended up in Ian's calm eye for about an hour, limiting its exposure to the worst of Ian's winds. Now, of course, the buildings did sustain some wind damage. However, improvements made to the property after 2004's Hurricane Charlie kept those damages to a minimum.
Because after Charlie, everything in our mind was, if we're going to do it and we're going to build it back, let's build it back better than it was. Let's be stronger. Let's make improvements every year to get ready for a bigger storm.
Though as we saw a year ago, it was the water, the storm surge, that caused the worst damage from Ian. Do you have any indication of how high the water came up here?
I think here it was probably 4 or 5 feet, so over the docks and into the dock houses, but not up into the buildings.
You would think storm surge like that would wash right over a tiny island like this. But right when you step off the boat and onto the dock, you can see how Cabbage Key was able to withstand Ian's surge. And what's something of a rarity here in Southwest Florida, there's a pretty steep elevation rise from the dock up to the inn and restaurant. In fact, it's a 30-foot elevation rise, making this one of the highest spots in Lee County. Southwest Florida naturally is very flat, so you probably guessed this hill is man-made. It comes courtesy of the first residents of Cabbage Key, the Calusa. Long before the first Europeans settled in the area, the Calusa were thriving here for some 2,000 years. The Calusa were known for building large mounds or middens out of shell and clay. One of those middens is right here on Cabbage Key.
The largest of the mounds were likely over 40 feet tall, and they were really huge complexes. So the mounds served several purposes, but one of them could have been certainly keeping out of the storm surge of tropical storms or hurricanes.
The inn and restaurant at Cabbage Key sit right on top of one of these shell mounds. During Ian, it provided natural protection from the rising waters.
So we sit here 20-plus feet above sea level with great views, and it almost doesn't feel like you're in Florida because of the elevation out here on Cabbage Key. But you can see where it also would really be helpful when you have these big storm surges, floods, and things like that.
So what lesson can we take from what happened here, or perhaps what didn't happen here in Cabbage Key during Ian? To me, it signals that we can stand up to even the worst hurricanes, as long as we're strategic. When we build, we need to do so with hurricanes in mind. We build not just to withstand the winds, but taking a cue from the first humans to live and thrive here, build at elevation to physically rise above the threat of storm surge. We do that, and we can keep coming back to our favorite spots like this one for years to come. From Cabbage Key, I'm meteorologist Jim Dickey, ABC 7.